and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Shayna Batterson, a writer located in Eugene, Oregon, who has been published with Covert Action magazine. I also have a Substack called The Red Letter, where I post links to my articles as well as my poetry. With me, as always, is my co-host Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we have a great guest today, Shayna.
Max Perry is an independent journalist based in Baltimore who is currently syndicated with CAM, and I suggest everyone check out his work. But as he mentioned, we have a guest for today's episode. We have joining us from Beijing, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. Ryan Perkins, who is a multimedia journalist who writes about history, economics, and geopolitics from an anti-imperialist perspective. You can find his work on Substack. His publication is called Anti-Imperialist and then History, Economics, and Geopolitics. Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi there. Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's great to have you. We'd like to talk with you about your two-part series entitled The Ghost and the Machine. Both articles are really fantastic, and I suggest for our listeners to read them. I'll put them in the links. The subtitle of the first article in the series is How the CIA Created the Modern Left and Why the Right Still Thinks It's a Marxist Plot. This is an important subject, I think, since if we want to understand the crisis within the left today, it is necessary to examine the history of the new left within the United States and Europe. Conversely, understanding this history also illustrates the absurdity of the arguments of right-wing figures like James Lindsay, who claim that the cultural Marxists, usually meaning like the Frankfurt School, infiltrated Western universities and smuggled in their somehow pro-Soviet and crypto-communist agendas, when rather these figures were often virulently against the USSR and even anti-communist in a more general sense, often working with the imperialist state, for example, like with Marcuse, who did anti-Soviet data analysis for the State Department. Do you think you could just start off by just sort of briefly explaining the U.S. intelligence agency's role in molding the, shall we say, compatible left?
Yes, sure. I mean, just to give you a little bit of background, I started researching this a couple of years ago because obviously I live in Beijing and I occasionally would go to the West and Canada and the UK. And I was just really shocked at what was going on there and talking to people who I thought were really quite informed and quite kind of knowledgeable. And they were genuinely convinced that this was some kind of Marxist plot to overthrow Western institutions. And so I started to look into it and research it, and that's what sort of led me to discover it wasn't anything of the sort. If you follow the trail of money and you follow it back, it's quite clear that what we kind of interpret as the modern left in the West is really the product of a very, very extensive intelligence funded campaign to create an anti-communist left. And if you trace it back to the end of the Second World War, you can see that this program really starts in earnest immediately after the Second World War finishes in Berlin itself, as a kind of test program where it's about winning hearts and minds in West Berlin. And then very quickly, it gets picked up and expanded. By 1950, it's sort of formalized in a CIA program, which was run primarily by James Jesus Angleton in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom had an enormous budget. It bankrolled all kinds of different intellectual programs. It paid for many of the left-wing journals in different European countries. It funded art exhibitions, book translations, academic conferences, and it was by the early 1960s, it was essentially the large, as it's mentioned in a book by Francis Stoner Saunders. It was essentially the largest single patron of intellectual life in the West. And it had a very specific focus. Its focus was on sponsoring intellectuals and intellectual movements, which eschewed the idea of revolution through class consciousness. It pushed back against Marxist analysis and very much championed an idea that revolution would be kind of achieved through the transformation of the individual without actually changing any of the societal structures of capitalism. So it was about changing the perception and the ideas of the individuals in society rather than actually changing the structure. And this idea, these sort of intellectual movements, although they weren't completely controlled by the CIA, the sort of main figures and the main ideas in those movements were heavily sponsored by the CIA from about 1950 up until about 1967, which is what part one in the series looks at, until about 1970. And then part two begins to look at how those ideas that were developed by the Congress for Cultural Freedom then later went on to be developed further into sort of like more extensive systems of social control.
Yeah, in your article, I thought it was interesting that you were speaking of the so-called culture wars and you located their origin in CIA headquarters and Washington, D.C. Do you think you could elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So as I said, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom starting in 1950, the CIA directly sponsored many of the ideas that we kind of associate with cultural Marxism today. Um, those ideas were then, those ideas after so in 1967, the funding for the Congress for Cultural Freedom was revealed by some investigative journalists at the New York Times, and I think Ramparts magazine also.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was in 1967 that those programs were officially curtailed, essentially because that created a kind of crisis of legitimacy for a lot of the organizations that were involved in that. And there's a short interim period from about 1967 to 1970 where it's taken up by another sort of slightly shadowy organization. But in 1970, that's when the Ford Foundation really kind of takes over. And that's a sort of evolutionary leap where it goes from a sort of shadowy, covert funding of intellectuals and intellectual movements and publications to a much more sort of formalized and privatized approach. And what the Ford Foundation does, because this is a really interesting period. So immediately after the Second World War, the primary perceived threat was Soviet communism and sort of state-backed socialism. By the mid-60s into the early 70s, you have the emergence of the civil rights movements. You have figures like Martin Luther King Jr., who's starting to put together the pieces. His analysis is starting to put together the pieces with civil rights, capitalism, neo-colonialism, the war in Vietnam and Algeria. And then you have Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, who are starting to put together sort of parallel social support systems. And so the threat now has expanded. The threat is both external and internal. So you see the approach change with the Ford Foundation, and what the Ford Foundation's focus was about taking that radical energy and those kind of revolutionary ideas and trying to funnel them into the system where it's more manageable and that kind of revolutionary energy can be dissipated. So the idea was to take that sort of revolutionary momentum and turn it into kind of reformist inertia. And it does this by funneling funding into the university system and into the legal system. And what it does is it takes a lot of these ideas and institutionalizes them and turns them from academic theories and academic interests into formalized university departments with kind of legitimate fields of intellectual study. So it creates university departments, it creates tenured professorships, and it really just funnels all of that radicalism from the street into a much more kind of manageable arena of politics and academia. And this is where you see the emergence of this is where kind of critical race theory gets mainstreamed in education and university departments, women's studies, gender studies, Latino studies, all of the kind of things that all of the kind of things now that are associated with woke left ideas were really kind of formalized. They're born out of intellectual ideas with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And then once the program shifts under the auspices of the Ford Foundation, that's when they become kind of institutionalized and become formalized within the structure of academia.
Do you feel like, because I know the Ford Foundation also, when the civil rights movement became sort of more mainstream, do you feel like the Ford Foundation's like pouring money into that was sort of to try and defang the sort of dual power and mutual aid that you were mentioning about the Panthers or Malcolm X, like that was what the purpose of that was to try and
Yes, I think that was definitely one of the purposes. I mean, it wasn't the Ford Foundation's approach. I don't think it was an alternative to overt repression. I mean, the overt repression was necessary and it remained, like it stayed there. So you still have that working alongside programs like COINTELPRO, the assassination of civil rights leaders. So that remained, but this was also another approach, and that was really about kind of trying to draw in the leaders of this movement and bring them into the tent, so to speak. So once they're inside, you have it's much more manageable because they're no longer attacking the system from outside. Yeah, so it moves from sort of radical reform into it moves from sort of radicalism into reform.
It's interesting what you're saying about these programs in universities, because what you're illustrating that happened is the exact opposite of what someone like Marcuse had proposed, who was saying the revolution would come from the students. And I know that a lot of people on the right point to Marcuse as being the father of wokeness, and he somehow infiltrated the CIA and turned the CIA Marxist or something. I don't know. But what do
not
you,
an exaggeration either. They will actually say stuff like that.
but
Yeah.
I mean, rather, I see it more as he very much, I mean, he was instrumental in creating the new left, but like, do you think that with like his ideas, which are oftentimes departed from more traditional left views, do you think he was helpful for creating the compatible left, so to speak?
Definitely. I mean, they were based out of Columbia University, primarily. So I mean, the idea that they're sort of high, that they would be highly, highly revolutionary organization seems unlikely. I think I mentioned in part one that the key thing to remember is that with the CIA funding for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was the CIA distinguished. The CIA didn't look at the left as a sort of monolithic bloc, which a lot of the conservatives in the United States at the time did. The CIA actually had a quite sophisticated way of looking at it, and it was able to sort of distinguish between the left, which posed a threat to the system, and the left, which didn't. And what it did was it funded the sort of intellectual streams that it didn't think posed a threat to the system. And within that are things very similar to the Frankfurt School, and ideas that didn't seek to address the kind of underlying structure of capitalism, but thought that capitalism could kind of be reformed from within, that it was just about changing the ideas of the people that were involved in the system rather than actually disrupting the architecture of the system. And by doing that, what they did was they essentially starved the radical left of oxygen, and created a whole ecosystem um, that functioned to create what we now call the modern left.
I wanted to ask you because one of the things I appreciate about your work is, or this two-part piece specifically, is that I feel like you're expanding upon, I mean, you mentioned Francis Donor Saunders, but there's also Gabriel Rockhill has a new book out as well. But I feel like you're adding another dimension to this conversation by talking about the right sort of political confusion being sort of almost equivalent to the left's political confusion about the authenticity or lack thereof of the new left and its, or the modern left, its current manifestation. But I mean, in the two pieces, I feel like you really sort of succinctly summarize the predicament we're in, where you've got the synthetic left on the one hand, which you correctly argue is a largely like a bastard child of Western intelligence agencies and is just masquerading as the left. But then on the other hand, you have the political right and like, these paleo conservatives who are equally confused and believe that this somehow represents like authentic Marxism or is somehow a logical outgrowth of it. But in addition to expanding upon what Rockhill and Saunders have covered in regards to the Frankfurt School and the CIA's funding of things like abstract expressionism and modern art. In the first part, I thought it was interesting that you touched on some neglected aspects as well. Like, for example, you briefly mentioned that the CIA also promoted avant-garde composers like Schoenberg. And
Mhm.
I know I'm not, I don't know much about Schoenberg's music, but I mean, I do know that Adorno was a musicologist and he was a huge proponent of Schoenberg's music, which he argued was like an authentic, anti-commercial artistic
Mhm.
response to, bourgeois culture. Although it's funny that apparently Schoenberg couldn't stand Adorno and they didn't get along personally. But could you talk about how the CIA also employed like radical modernist classical music in its propaganda? Was that because it was like with the abstract expressionism, it represented individual expression as opposed to, I guess,
Socialist
yeah,
realism. Yeah.
yeah, or like older composers that were popular in the Soviet Union.
I mean, one of the key things, one of the key objectives with the Congress for Cultural Freedom was the perceived threat from the Soviet Union was not just economic. The Soviet Union at the time offered not just an economic alternative, but also like ideological alternatives. Like it was an entirely alternative worldview. So the CIA realized that if they really wanted to try and counter this threat, they needed to do the same thing. It wasn't just about economics. It wasn't just about the kind of social democratic model in the 1950s and 60s about sort of providing people with slightly better living standards. They needed to provide that whole kind of ideological ecosystem as a rival alternative to Soviet communism. And to do that, it wasn't just intellectuals that they sponsored. They also sponsored abstract expressionist artists. And the idea was that this was kind of the ultimate expression of kind of liberalism, of like of freedom and individualism. And then, as you mentioned, they sponsored these kind of atonal and 12 tone musical movements, and these were supposed to be kind of like kind of a musical counterpoint to kind of the idea of kind of this monolithic socialism, this kind of like monolithic Stalinist ideology, a sort of spontaneous expression of individualism. But it encompassed the whole spectrum of kind of intellectual expression, from abstract art through like atonal music, and even into things like beat poetry. The whole kind of spectrum of intellectual expression as a sort of, and it was designed to present it was designed to have this sort of veneer of radicalism. It had to maintain this appearance of radicalism because the objective was not to make it mainstream. The objective was to essentially catch people who had become disillusioned or disenfranchised by the system and were kind of drifting out of the mainstream. And it was designed to catch them before they encountered Marxism or any kind of actual radical ideology. The idea was to present it as a radical alternative to the mainstream, um, in order to stop people actually getting to that point.
It's interesting because you're sort of touching on it. The CIA was kind of sponsoring, I guess you could say, individualism in art and culture, where it's these works that are held up as sort of symbols of the individual freedoms of the West. But also, you can sort of see this presence of individualism in the hippie movement of the 60s. And I'm just curious, do you think that the quote turn inward that occurred at that time with the focus on Eastern spirituality and consciousness raising drugs like LSD worked to orient people away from a materialist analysis of class struggle and the economic system of society towards more idealist and subjectivist interpretation of some nebulous conception of rebellion, like you can fight the system just on an individual level?
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly it. With the hippie movement in the 1960s, that's the coming of age of a huge demographic spike, the post-war kind of baby boomer generation. And I think the hippie movement is kind of an unintended, but well, not necessarily unintended, but not necessarily deliberate consequence of this campaign, the Congress for Cultural Freedom movement. You can see the success of the movement in the hippie movement of the 1960s, because had that post-war generation, if it had, with its radical energy that it had, if it had been infused by a kind of genuine radical socialist ideology, it would have been the catalyst for societal change. But what you see in the hippie movement is really a mirror of this kind of divorce that the CCF created, where it wasn't about structural change, it was about revolution through the transformation of the individual. You change the system by subjectively changing the individual. And the hippie movement is a perfect mirror of that sort of separation that was sponsored, the CIA started sponsoring in the 1950s. And it wasn't about attacking the system, it was about dropping out of the system. And it was about, the revolution is not going to be in the factory, it's going to be inside your own mind. You alter the system by changing the individual, through, as you said, like Eastern spirituality, sexual liberation, and psychedelic drugs, which, you know, I, from a capitalist perspective, that's a very safe form of revolution. And we see the sort of legacy of it today. It had the appearance of radical transformation, but without any substance to it.
You were speaking before about the way that these big foundations like the Ford Foundation, the role that they played in like the academization, I guess is what you'd call it, of the left, and it's sort of enmeshing with the academy and these big institutions. And where does, I mean, as far as the NGO industrial complex goes, how does George Soros fit into all this? Because his he seems like a figure that's equally like the political right is massively confused about. Because if you look at, I mean, if you look at the political right, they speak about him like he's this communist, when if you actually look into his history, he was instrumental in bringing down like countries behind the Iron Curtain, sponsoring Poland's solidarity, in his native Hungary as well, the student protest movements there, and so on and so forth. Not to mention, once those countries reinstated the free market, he made huge profits as a currency manipulator. So he's this hyper capitalist who's helped bring down communism, and yet the political right today thinks that he's somehow a communist, I guess because of the some of the socially liberal things that the Open Society Foundation sponsors as far as like domestically and abroad, the way that it's weaponized by like you mentioned USAID in your
Yeah.
article, the way that but even domestically, like you'll see like for example, the Open Society Foundation sponsors stuff like when I was living in New York, there was a big sex worker convention that was put on, and of course it was sponsored by the OSF. So of course, right-wing people see that and they're like, "See, Soros is trying to normalize, legalize prostitution and all these like woke causes and all that." So how does I don't want to jump ahead too far, but how does the Soros and his ideas influenced by Karl Popper sort of fit into the whole NGO industrial complex, corralling of the left, the modern left. Where does he fit into all this?
So he's really the next phase in the evolution of this system. So from 1970 onwards, the Ford Foundation is really kind of embedding and formalizing a lot of these ideas within academia. By 1983, in 1983, you have the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, which was kind of created to do what the CIA used to do secretly, but to do it publicly. And this is where George Soros enters the picture. So I think it was about 1985. He partners with the NED in order to bankroll the NGO movements. And at the time, Poland was kind of identified as the sort of chink in the armor of uh, Eastern Europe, Eastern European socialism. So Soros partners with the NED, and they funnel a lot of money into NGO movements in Poland, which funnel money into Solidarity. And there's also a role for Pope John Paul II as well in there as well. And this, in many ways, I think you can think of the operation in Poland almost as a sort of as a trial run, almost like a test case for how to really use this ideology to dismantle a state and to sort of take it apart. And it becomes very much the blueprint, which is then expanded out into the whole of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet space, and also then into the rest of the global South. And it's quite a sophisticated strategy. But as you said, the Open Society Foundation also operates in Britain and in France and in the United States. But what they have is they have a sophisticated kind of dual strategy where in the imperial core, so in the United States, their role is much like the Ford Foundation. Their role is to take radical energy and funnel it into the system. Okay, so to bring it back inside the tent and make it manageable, to kind of institutionalize that energy and then diffuse it. Outside of the imperial core, the function of these NGOs is to essentially set up parallel institutions with the institutions in the country, subvert them from outside, and then ultimately to take them over when necessary. So it's very clever because Soros can say, well, yeah, we operate in all these countries. We operate in France, we operate in the United States. They don't have any problem with it, but in these other countries, it's because they hate freedom and they hate democracy, and it's not the case. It's just two different systems that are operating. In the West, those systems operate to kind of reinforce the established hierarchies by dissipating that radical energy and funneling it into the system. Whereas outside of the imperial core, their role is to create parallel institutions that rival the institutions of the state and ultimately subvert them from without.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head. That's a really important distinction and like a thing that people don't really understand is sort of the role that an NGO like or CIA cutout like the OSF plays domestically versus abroad. Because here domestically, you always hear like about how Soros is behind, I remember during Occupy, it was like, there was all these rumors swirling about because a lot of the activist groups participating, they were taking money from like the Tides Foundation or whatever, and then it turned out that Soros had poured money into the Tides Foundation, so therefore, like Soros was bankrolling OWS, or you even hear the same thing about BLM, of course. Like but there is a kernel of truth to it. Like when the right is saying this stuff about how like the George Floyd protests or whatever, being Soros is behind them. It's like, of course, they have this very confused understanding of that, but there is like a tiny nugget of truth in it, in that he's not behind these movements. What he's doing is these are, legitimate social issues that spark protest movements, but then it's corralled and it's controlled and it's brought back under this like institutionalized control by through his machinations. Anyway, I'll let Shayna ask the next question, but thank you for that. It's great.
Yeah, I think that was a really great distinction you were making too, Ryan. And I think, it's especially important because I know that Soros's foundation is sort of worked hand in glove with the U.S. empire's aims of promoting regime change in other countries. And I guess it's kind of a more general question, but do you think that a lot of this focus in the New Left, which was sort of, promoted by the intelligence agencies, the sort of the value placed on sexual liberation and these other socially liberal things, do you think that the importance of that is then used to get people within the imperial core to support regime change efforts in other countries that are more socially conservative?
Yeah, I think that I think that addresses another point that I raised in the second part in the series, where this ideology, as it kind of coalesces into a kind of coherent sort of ideological framework, by the sort of mid 90s, it becomes the sort of chosen ideology of what I called the extreme center. So it's like in the 90s, like bourgeois politics just solidifies into sort of like a monolithic institution where everyone agrees on everything. There's absolutely the distinctions may have been minimal before that, but like by about the mid 90s, there's functionally no difference between sort of any of the political parties in Western bourgeois democracy. And by the mid 90s, this ideology becomes the chosen ideology of the extreme center because it's the only thing that offers any kind of, it's the only thing that could pass for a vision. It's the only thing that could pass for an idea of a political vision. And it's one of the reasons that it's chosen is because it's fundamentally depoliticizing. It doesn't challenge anything. It doesn't promise anything. It doesn't provide anything. And it's not going to lead to any kind of change, any meaningful change. It's politically very, very useful from the perspective of power because it's fundamentally depoliticizing. It reduces any kind of debate to one of basically just aesthetics. It's not about the ethics of capital management. It's about the ethnicity of the manager, which isn't going to change anything ultimately. It suddenly becomes incredibly important which ethnic group the defense minister is, not which country he's bombing. But it's also a way, if you, as you kind of move geopolitically, as you kind of move into the 90s and the early 2000s, the idea of global conflict against the sort of last remaining obstacles to global hegemony obviously become, Russia, Iran, China, and you have to ideologically align people in a way that makes them prepared to confront these countries. And you no longer have this monolithic, abstract idea of communism or communist expansion to mobilize them. And that's where this ideology really pays off for the ruling class, because that becomes the mobilizing ideology. What's the one thing that you can use to mobilize people against a really sort of like diverse array of different countries and cultures? The one thing that you can use to mobilize them is this kind of nebulous idea of like individual of the liberation of the individual. Because the one label that you could possibly put on these countries is that they're socially conservative. And I think I'm not sure if that was intentional. I'm not sure if somebody sat down and drafted that. I think it's possibly more a case of like an evolution in terms of its utility. But clearly that's kind of what's happened. It's been used to mobilize people in the West, to mobilize their animosity against countries that are seen as obstacles to global hegemony.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be the case with not just Russia, but like all the post-Soviet states and its near abroad where like, the big one that they've jumped on is like the grievances of like sexual minorities, like
Mhm.
in these countries that and it's been an incredibly successful propaganda campaign as far as like mobilizing Western liberals into seeing the Kremlin as like this nefarious force, and that now like a social cause discrimination against gays is being tied and wedded to things like NATO expansion and
Yeah.
like bringing democracy or so-called to Central Asia and these places that like the average Western liberal couldn't find on a map, but like that's now. Yeah,
Vital.
obviously they were very successful, like also with like they did that with women's rights in Afghanistan as well. But like, it's been very successful as far as like, and even though it's so hypocritical, because of course, the United States is in bed with like Gulf state monarchies that like, have the death penalty for homosexuality, but somehow they've made Russia and like all these other countries and it's near abroad that they want to have these color revolutions in, that's been like one of their, big wedge issues to like ram that home. But I wanted to ask you about one thing I thought was really interesting in the first part was that you mentioned this former Soviet journalist and KGB defector by the name of Yuri Bezmenov.
Rebezmanov, yeah.
And I actually had not heard of him. I think I had seen clips of him around before, but I wasn't aware of who he was. But you kind of identify him as one of the sources of this cultural Marxism canard, so to speak. And I looked into his background, and I guess he was involved with the Birchers, like the John Birch Society, and also the Moonies, the Korean Unification Church cult. And has a pretty seedy, sketchy background. And I guess my question for you is, do you think that when he defected from the Soviet Union, like that this was part of like the agreement, like that he was put up to this, like by agreeing to defect, he sort of became like a propagandist disseminating this stuff? And do you think that I guess what I'm asking is like, do you think that the right wing's sort of political confusion and response with this kind of like misinterpretation of things, that comes from like these paleo libertarian, paleo conservative authors, like, I mean, Anthony Sutton is one of them, but I mean, I guess, do you think that the right wing's response to the modern left with this whole cultural Marxism trope, do you think that that's something that's also engineered by, because I mean, this guy, was an intelligence operative, seemingly. So, I mean, and he's a defector, and then he's spreading this stuff, and he's seen as authentic because well, I was in the Soviet Union, I know how they operate. So this is, this the new left, with in academia, Marxism's taken over. Like this is all part of a Soviet plot. I mean, do you think that this is something that also, because I think it's sort of an interesting piece to the puzzle because I was not aware of him, so I thought that that was pretty interesting.
He's a very interesting figure. Arguably, I mean, so he defects to the United States in I think the 90s, in the mid 1970s, late 1970s. He was posing as a Soviet journalist in Greece at the time of his defection, which means that he wasn't a particularly he wasn't a senior KGB official. He was, an operative in Greece. But when he's presented in the Western media and by himself as being a very, very senior KGB official with access to the absolute top levels of KGB intelligence. And he's a very important figure in developing this idea that that this new left is actually a Marxist plot, because he after moving to Canada, he then suddenly appears in a series of he gives a series of talks and he goes on a lecture circuit, and he wrote a book about this long-term Soviet infiltration program to undermine and overthrow the United States by infiltrating its institutions and subverting its ideology. And he claims this is going to be like a 30, 40-year program, that kind of thing. We know, obviously, from all of the Soviet archives that have been declassified, we know nothing of this actually existed. So to get back to your question, what is the origin of this? I don't know. It's difficult to say. It's difficult to say whether or not Bezmenov was just very, very good at reading the room, whether he was just an opportunist. But I would say the evidence against that is the timing of when he becomes a kind of important an important figure in this field. And he kind of emerges in the late 70s, early 80s, which is about the same time that you see prominent neoconservative figures coming into the US administration. So you have Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney taking on very important positions in the Ford administration. And it was the Ford administration that was really kind of when the neoconservative movement kind of embedded itself within the United States.
Yeah, they had like a what was the Halloween massacre or something? They had like there was like a bunch of firings where I
Yeah,
guess the realists like Kissinger were,
yeah.
and
Is
then Cheney and Rumsfeld. Yeah, I think it's the Halloween massacre or something like that.
Yeah. And that's really when the sort of neoconservative movement embeds itself within the sort of United States infrastructure of government. I've written about this separately, but I kind of say that what I've said is that that really was a pushback by the military industrial complex against movements towards sort of détente with the Soviet Union. The military industrial complex decided to fully embed its kind of representatives to ensure, presidential policy stayed within their control. And then you get Bezmenov come in. So Bezmenov comes in, Bezmenov appears at about the same time that the neoconservative movement is embedding itself in the administration. And that's about the same time that Donald Rumsfeld starts his Team B program, where he says, all of this CIA analysis about the Soviets, Soviet weaponry and Soviet intentions is all wrong. The Soviets have been busy, busy, busy. They've been building up their arsenals. They're secretly planning to attack the United States. And then Bezmenov appears as this kind of like celebrity defector. He goes on book tours, he gives interviews on national television, he does a lecture circuit. And that reinforces the same message that you're getting from the neoconservative movement at the same time. I mean, how that was coordinated, I don't know, but it definitely looks like it was part of the same process. Most likely, Bezmenov kind of, he comes across as a kind of snake oil salesman opportunist. Most likely, when he defected, he started talking about something like this, and it sort of probably developed from there. Um, who knows? Who knows? But it's clearly the timing and the sort of situation definitely, there's definitely a very large correlation between these two. And then of course you have the Reagan administration come in with sort of this morning in America kind of idea. It fits very neatly within the whole kind of ideological picture at the time.
Yeah, I wrote a review of a memoir by these two journalists, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, who were actually the first two Western journalists that went into Afghanistan during the middle of the Afghan-Soviet War. They were the first Western team of journalists to go in there. And of course, what they observed on the ground was very different than what was, being said by the government. So like right around that time, that's where, Brzezinski came in and that war was instigated. But in their memoir, long story short, they talk a lot about the role that Team B played in convincing Carter to give Brzezinski, the go-ahead to launch that proxy war and fund the Mujahideen. But yeah, they talk a lot about that neoconservative soft coup, I guess you could palace coup, whatever you want to call it, with Rumsfeld and Cheney. But I wasn't aware of this guy, so it's kind of an interesting, and it seems like a lot of these kinds of people like that have like Anthony Sutton is another one. I mean, he has all kinds of, he's this paleoconservative outsider on the surface, but then you look into his background, he's like palling around with neoconservative figures, and he's like, so it does seem like a lot of this like stuff is some kind of does come from intelligence agencies somehow, or is a narrative. I mean, you could also argue that a lot of this stuff is just repackaging of old stuff like, Judeo-Bolshevik, ideas, that the Okhrana, the Tsarist police, spread when the Bolsheviks were organizing the revolution, that they put this out, that was a big conspiracy. So you could argue that this sort of stuff is just sort of repackaging of that. But anyway, I'll let Shayna ask another question.
Yeah, not to stray too much from your Ghosts in the Machine series, but just you mentioned about the military industrial complex, and I know you've written some very good things about that. And do you think that I mean, still today, do you think it's important for the US to pr sort of promote fear of other countries' purported aggressiveness so as to keep the population supportive of massive military budgets? Because I know at the stage of capitalism that the US, for example, is at, the military spending is really almost economically necessary at this point.
Yeah, I mean, like it's always everything is always presented as a threat. It's always presented as a threat. There's a constant manufacturing of fear on every level, and it goes and not just fear, but the idea that you see it, and it's a very powerful kind of sub theme in Hollywood entertainment. The idea that very complex geopolitical problems have very simple violent solutions. Um, the idea that you can resolve complex problems through resorting to kind of extra, and it's always extra legal force. It's always force that's outside of the system, which is it's an allegorical retelling of the story that they want you to believe about the United States. That going outside of democratized norms or politicized norms is somehow more noble. It's like it's not noble to sort of, it's the only response to a kind of decaying system. But it's you see it almost every sort of in almost every form of Hollywood or Western entertainment, pretty much since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, your work, I think, is very ambitious. One other aspect in this series that I liked was that you were trying to explain. I mean, it's a almost an impossible. It's so confused. It's almost hard to grasp. But like some of the right's political response to like things like your article mentions, like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or like the cabal at Davos, or the World Economic Forum, these sort of big world or what the right calls globalist institutions, that's what they do is somehow associated with Marxism, or with like the whole idea, like Klaus Schultz, you'll own nothing and be happy. That's somehow been, even though this is like the height of techno feudal or
Yeah, yeah.
hyper capitalist. I mean, I don't even know how you approach a question like this when the level of political confusion is just off the scale. But you
Yeah.
actually do sort of try and
Yeah, I think
grasp
because
it, which I think is really kind of makes your piece worth reading. So I do recommend people read it. But go ahead.
yeah, I think because what we're seeing is like this attempt by monopoly capital to really just grab hold of everything that's left in the world, like the last vestiges of any traditional economy, the last vestiges of resources, of everything that's left. And to do that, what they're doing is they're trying to impose a completely universal system of control. And that control is it's financialized control over the whole planet, essentially trying to lock in neocolonial resource extraction economy on the global south, trying to lock in people within the imperial core, trying to condition them to accept a diminished future. Okay, because capitalism isn't going to be able to provide you with a better future. If in order to maintain the power structure that exists, and maintain this kind of monopoly accumulation, this monopoly acquisition of everything of capital. In order to do that, what they have to do is they have to lock the people in the South into their current state of economic development, lock them in as essentially resource providers for the economies, in the global North. And it needs to condition the people in the global North to just accept less in the future. That's the only way that you can maintain this structure going into the future. And to do that, what they've done is they've appropriated all of this language that was so useful in dismantling the sovereignty of the former Soviet space. It was useful in dismantling the sovereignty in nations in the global South. It was weaponized by George Soros and used by the NGOs. But now that language has been taken and it's been used to camouflage and hide this financial takeover of the entire planet. But because it's using the same language, opponents to it they're not able to see through the language into what's actually being done. So they interpret, and this is the greatest irony, opponents interpret they interpret this language as the language of some kind of crypto-communist conspiracy, of some resurrection of Marx, because they view what's happening through this lens of anti-communist propaganda. And it's the anti-communist propaganda that the system created in the first place. So it's viewing its enemy through the glasses that were given to it by the enemy, if you see what I mean. And it's unable to get past that. And so because of that, it's unable to actually identify who the real opponent is. Because when people like Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, when they talk about you will own nothing and be happy, what they're talking about is a rentier's paradise. It's where, food, water, housing, air, these things are going to become subscription services supplied by a platform monopoly. He's not talking about collectivizing agriculture. He's not talking about redistributing.
Yeah. Yeah. Marx never said you're going to eat 3D printed cricket burgers and bugs. I mean, I don't know. This stuff is just, yeah, it's such a politically confused landscape. But I think that you really do a good job explaining something that's very, very, very complex and sort of, I mean, again, it's like to tackle that level of confusion where someone like a Bill Gates or a George Soros or Klaus Schultz who are the height of uh, of neoliberalism and capitalism. Or I mean, I guess but again, what I was saying about the repackaging of ideas, it really is sort of the same absurd kind of stuff repackaged. Like for example, like what people like Anthony Sutton, when they write a book like that the Bolsheviks were controlled by Wall Street,
Yeah.
that was who was behind the Russian Revolution. It's sort of a repackaging of that trope.
Mhm.
And you could also arguably, at least in some cases, say that very often these are bywords for you know uh, anti-Semitism and stuff like that. But I mean that's a whole separate
Yeah.
conversation. But
The
anyway,
misdirection is very, very useful. It's very useful because by part of this misdirection is it ends up getting people in this sort of theater of conflict where they're arguing over pronouns and statues when asset managers are rewriting the financial codes of the entire planet, and it's like you're just focusing on the wrong level here. It's like it's not about the statues, it's about the complete takeover of the complete financialization of the entire planet. And that's the danger. That's the danger of this confusion.
well, I think it's also very hard to sort of combat this sort of thing with the political right when you have people on the synthetic left, the fake left, supporting some of this stuff. Like, for example, like, I remember when shortly after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got elected in New York as a congresswoman, not long, and says she's a democratic socialist, she's a member of DSA and all that. Not long after she was elected, she started supporting this campaign called Birth Strike, which was this very sort of like neo-Malthusian idea about the response to climate change should be for women to refuse to have children. This very, the exact kind of thing that the like right latches onto about the sort of depopulation agenda behind a lot of these big climate initiatives and this climate hysteria. And and then you look at also like the sort of like, UN Agenda 21 and like a lot of these, again, this like these sustainable development goals that if you look at like a lot of the faux left, a lot of that kind of stuff is supported by these ostensibly socialist parties. So it's very hard to turn around and say this isn't really um, Marxist when you have a lot of like imposter Marxist organizations going along with these big, you know, uh, greenwashing initiatives or these like campaigns that have a very pro-establishment agenda and also are shifting the blame for something like an ecological crisis, the severity of which is debatable, but like onto the average person, like raising taxes, on trying to get rid of farming altogether, making smart cities, all this kind of stuff. So what I guess my point is when the faux left is going along with it, it's very hard to sit there and try and explain, no, this has nothing to do with something like Marxism, what's going on at, in the World Economic Forum and, these elite cabals sitting around talking about how they're going to lower the human population to save the planet or whatever. But when you have the faux left going along with these kind of narratives, it makes it even harder to push back against.
Yeah, I think once you begin to see that it's that the really the whole thing is astroturfed, the ideology is astroturfed and it's patched on over the top of a kind of um, fake center left establishment, and then it's tagged on to the development goals, and it's tagged on to it's used to disguise what's happening with ESGs and that kind of thing. Once you kind of once you see the power structure behind it, it's very easy. It becomes easier to recognize the fact that essentially the ideology is just camouflage. It's not a core ideology which has an infrastructure. It's essentially papered over this power construct. And the power construct is very simple to identify. It's monopoly finance. That's it at its core. And everything else kind of follows from there. And once you kind of identify that, everything else begins to fall into place. And I think that was the hardest part of putting all this together is just by following the money back through the chain, you see where it's all coming from. And once you do that, everything begins to start making sense and kind of fall into place.
Yeah, that's a great point. It does sort of act like an ideological packaging. And I just another question I have is do you see this focus on like with the UN, for example, or these other foundations like the Gates Foundation, this focus on carbon reduction and allegedly sustainable consumption, penalizing the global south and sort of being this imperialist attempt to prevent developing nations from industrializing?
Absolutely, yeah, that's entirely what it is. It's when you kind of break it down and you actually look at what it means in real terms for these developing nations, it's essentially the sort of neoliberal globalization program of the 90s, neoliberal globalization 2.0. sort of program of the 90s, but repackaged in this ideological language of sort of concern for the environment and gender equality. It's not sort of fundamentally different. It's about locking the global south into being resource providers for the global north and ensuring that they don't develop industrially in a way that could present any kind of rival to the global north.
How do we, I mean, I know that this is sort of a difficult question, but how does, given the state, I mean, this is a question I have for myself that I can't really answer, but I guess I'll just put it to you. I mean, given the current state that the Western left is in, where it's just completely divorced from any kind of internationalism, it's so backwards. I mean, you're in China, but I mean, in the United States, I mean, it just cannot get any more backwards here as far as like the state of the Western left. So I guess my question to you is, where do we go from here as far as like I mean, I think it is work like what you're doing and like what people like Gabriel Rockhill are doing as far as like addressing how we got to this point, what happened, how did Western Marxism, deviate so much? How did it become entrenched in the academy and absorbed into these institutions where now, basically you have like corporate America adopting a lot of this stuff. And I guess it's like, how do we get to a good place with the Western left or I mean, probably a long journey. I mean, but it does seem like, at least in the sense, there are some positive signs in the sense that something like socialism is no longer a dirty word in U.S. politics. And unfortunately, now it means, people associate socialism with like, again, like Bernie Sanders or this sort of social democracy and things like that. But at least it's, sort of there's a just given the state of inequality and the economic crisis, it's kind of forcing people to address class again. But as far as the Western left goes, I mean, it just still couldn't be any more backwards. So I guess sort of my question is like, where do we go from here? Is it by interrogating this how we got to be in this backward state in the first place?
Yeah, I think the first thing is we have to understand what this is, and understand the power structure that created it. The problem is once you go down that rabbit hole, you begin to realize that the whole edifice of the left in the West is completely compromised. And so, apart from making ourselves aware of that and kind of building institutions and infrastructure outside of it, um, I don't know. It's very difficult to see a way out. But I suspect I have from my other research that I've been looking into. I suspect there's going to be kind of economic opportunities to do that in the not so distant future, because I can't help but feel the urgency with which all of this is being uh, rolled out and implemented, and the moral urgency of the need to sort of defeat these last kind of impediments to global control, through conflict with Russia and China and Iran, to really kind of to the urgency with which that's being pursued makes me believe that the kind of economic crisis that's occurring in capitalism might be more developed than we can see. And the only way that I think people are going to really, the vast majority of people are really going to wake up and understand what's going on is when they become materially impacted by that. Because I mean, it's very easy to live in, it's very easy to it's very easy to live in a world of illusions when it's very comfortable. But once that world becomes uncomfortable, it becomes much more difficult to convince yourself of these things. And it's only really when that material when that material world becomes more uncomfortable that people really begin to kind of examine reality. And I think that's really the only kind of way forward in the West.
If you don't
It's
mind,
sad that that's the only way forward, but I can't sort of see a way out of it.
well, if you don't mind my asking, just and I know you don't want to get into China too much, but I do have to ask you anecdotally, just sort of what is the just from your vantage point? I mean, I see these online memes about things like is it Baizuo? It's like the there's like a Chinese word for like how backwards the Western left is. I'm not sure what the actual term is, but I
I'm
think
not
it's Baizuo or something like that. I could be wrong. But I guess my question is, what is the from from the Chinese perspective? I mean, how backwards do they think the Western left is? I mean, it must just be a complete joke. I mean, as far as like uh because the Western left is so hostile and antagonistic to China and really has fallen in line as far as like, this basically like this new Cold War and demonizing China and and at the same time, China, I mean, China is also the big right, as far as the right wing goes, the big bogeyman as far as like, there's
yeah.
always this stuff about Soros and China. China's this uh, big bad actor that's behind everything. So, and I just imagine like from the perspective of China, it just must be completely absurd. I mean, so I guess my question is. Anecdotally, what is the perspective there on how backwards the left is here, and if it even considers it at all?
I think most Chinese people who take an interest in it, because for a lot of Chinese people, it's largely irrelevant. But for Chinese people that take an interest in it, they see, especially sort of the extremes of the modern left in the West, they see it as odd. A lot of them don't believe it. A lot of them simply think that it's kind of internet exaggeration, especially the kind of extremities of like trans rights and things like that. They think that it's um, perhaps a tiny thing that happened in one corner of the West that's been kind of exaggerated and blunt, which is really weird because that's exactly what I thought until I spent some time in Canada and I realized no,
Yeah,
Well,
no,
I
it's
think
real.
it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers the way it's taken over.
I think a lot because a lot of it sounds so absurd, you have to see it to believe it.
I was in the same boat. I was in exactly the same boat. And like I was kind of like, it's just the internet. They're just blowing this completely out of proportion. And then I spent a year in Canada. And I was like, it's no, this is real. Like I was sort of scratching my head. And that's what spurred me into actually researching this. And I spent a couple of years like going down the rabbit hole of like just following all these different threads because I just couldn't actually believe what had happened. And I was like, surrounded by people who were telling me that it was a Marxist conspiracy, people who I respected. And I was like, it can't be. Like I live in a communist country. This isn't it.
They're like, huh?
So, yeah, so most Chinese people think that it's, internet exaggeration. But then when you get up to within the sort of Chinese intellectual movement, sorry, Chinese academics, I think they very much understand the US political system for what it is. They understand it as it is a bourgeois democracy. You have two parties that essentially serve the primary constituent, which is capital.
You mean to tell me that China is not a capitalist country, a state capitalist country, and that mind blown. I mean, that in and of itself, that's the Western left's um, interpretation of China is that it's betrayed every principle of Marxism and that it's sold out and that it's a
No.
capitalist country now. And they need to read Lacerdo, but yeah.
No, I mean it employs free market mechanisms in certain areas of the economy, primarily at the low end of primarily at the kind of low value end of manufacturing. But as you move up the value chain, the closer you get to kind of the primary inputs, all of that is entirely state owned, and most importantly, the entire financial sector is almost exclusively state owned. There's a tiny fraction of private finance, but the vast bulk of the almost the entirety of the banking sector is entirely state-owned and finance is state-directed. And that's the key thing. I mean, that's the really key separation between a sort of socialist economy and a free market economy. In a free market economy, you have a finance sector which is in charge, like capitalism, like the clue is in the name. It's run by and for capital. You have capital. They have this government that essentially works for them. Um, and they run the economy and they allocate the resources. And then in China, you have the government, and the government controls all the primary inputs. So it controls steel production and electricity generation, telecommunications, banking, finance. All of that is run by the state for the benefit of the economy, but more broadly for the benefit of society at large.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, like Lacerdo always talks about. I mean, really, it's really not too much different from what the new economic policy they had there, the Soviet Union in the 20s. But you were going to say something, Shayna?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, well, in the West, it's the opposite. Instead of the state controlling the banks, basically, the private banks control the state, and I feel like that's really what we're seeing with a lot of these proposed things, like the sort of subscription service economy and all this. A lot of it is the financialization and driven by what the private banking interests want to see happen.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's exactly it. In the West, I think the political structure is more about it's about selling you the policy decisions that have already been made. That you get to elect the spokesman that you want to sell you the decision that's already been made.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, and in the United States, they would have us believe that like people in China, like their access to the internet is like completely censored, and yet here we are having a conversation with you right over Zoom. It's just completely absurd. Well, yeah, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. Do you have any final questions, Shayna?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. It's really been great to talk with you, and I suggest everyone read your work because I think what you're doing is really important.
Oh, thank you very much. That's really kind of you. Thank you, and thank you very much for.
Yeah, I mean, you're really doing good stuff. I mean, I started to read a few of your other articles. Shayna came across your work first and sent it to me, and I was like, oh, we should have this guy on as a guest. So, yeah, I mean, I hope you continue to do maybe even do a part three, or maybe even consider turning it into a book or whatever, man. You're doing really good
I
work.
was thinking about that. I was thinking about that actually.
Yeah, it's really important stuff. Um, Ryan Perkins, thank you for coming on Captive Minds. If you're watching us on YouTube, please remember to hit like and subscribe. Or if you're watching us on Substack, please do the same. If you're watching us on Substack, we have a YouTube channel. It's Captive Minds Pod. If you're watching us on YouTube, our Substack is it's shaynabatterson.substack.com. We'll post links to Ryan's articles and his Substack, so be sure to check those out. Thank you so much for coming on, and thanks for tuning in and watching and listening to Captive Minds. We'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.